The corral appeared out of the thorns like a memory the land had been keeping to itself, and when Delia Marsh finally saw the whole shape of it, dry-laid stone, standing 4 feet high in a perfect ring beneath the noon sun, she sat down on a fallen post and cried, the way a person cries only when they have been proven right about something they nearly gave up on. Below her, 400 goats moved through what had been an impassable sea of mesquite 2 years before, and the ground they walked on was open now, grassed over, breathing. The men who had laughed in the county courthouse were not there to see it, but word of it would reach them soon enough. 2 springs earlier, on a cold March morning in 1889, Delia Marsh stood at the back of a crowded room in the courthouse of a dry Texas county and raised her hand for a parcel no one else wanted. She was 26 years old, a widow of 14 months, and she had $11 and change folded into a handkerchief pinned inside her dress. The parcel was 75 acres of caliche and thorn scrub that had gone to the county for back taxes, when the man who owned it walked off and died somewhere north, owing 3 years of assessments that came to $9.40. Nobody bid against her. A cattleman near the front turned around to look at her the way a man looks at a stray dog that has wandered into church, and he said, loud enough for the room, that she would have done better to burn the $11 for the warmth of it. The auctioneer, not unkind, asked her twice if she understood what she was buying. She said she did. She did not fully, but she understood the one thing that mattered, which was that it was hers now and no one could take it. And for a woman who had spent her whole life on land that belonged to husbands and fathers and banks, that was worth more than $9.40. She signed her name, took her paper, and walked out into a wind that smelled of dust and mesquite smoke, and behind her she heard the laughing start. The land, when she reached it that afternoon, was worse than the talk. Mesquite grew there in a way that was less a stand of trees than a slow green war. It came up thick as a man's arm and thin as a whip, tangled with catclaw and prickly pear, so dense in places that she could not walk 10 feet without turning sideways or bleeding. The thorns took her sleeve and then her forearm, and left a line of red beads that she wiped on her skirt without slowing. She had heard the cattleman curse mesquite her whole life. It drank the water the grass wanted. It choked out the range. It broke plows and lamed horses and hid rattlesnakes in its shade. And once it took hold of a pasture, there was no getting it out but by axe and fire and years. And even then, it came back from roots that ran deeper than a well. Men who owned thousands of acres let their mesquite alone because the arithmetic of clearing, it never came out in their favor. And here she was, a widow with $11 owning 75 acres of nothing but. She stood in the middle of it as the light went orange and thought, plainly and without drama, that she might have made a terrible mistake. Then she thought about the beans in her wagon and the 2 goats tied to the tailboard, and she made a small fire in a clear spot and slept beside it. And in the morning she began. She did not begin with an axe. That was the thing the town could never have guessed, and it was the thing that made all the difference. Delia Marsh had grown up poor in the hill country, the daughter of a woman who kept goats, because goats were what poor people kept, and she had spent 10,000 hours of her childhood watching the animals eat. She knew a thing about goats that the cattlemen did not trouble to learn, because cattlemen despised goats the way rich men despise the tools of the poor. She knew that a goat is not a grazer, but a browser, that it does not want the grass at all, that its whole heart bends toward brush and leaf and bark and thorn, and that a goat will strip a mesquite of every green thing it carries, and then, given time and hunger, will girdle the bark and kill the tree where it stands. She had watched her mother's small herd turn a brushy draw into open pasture over 3 summers, back when she was a girl too young to understand she was watching a lesson. Now, she stood in her own thorn scrub with her own 2 nannies and did the arithmetic in her head the way she would do it 1,000 more times before it was over. 2 goats could not clear 75 acres in a lifetime. But 2 goats, bred and kept and multiplied, could become 20, and 20 could become 100, and 100 goats let loose on mesquite in a fenced advance, moved section by section, might in 3 or 4 years do what a crew of men with axes could not do in 10. It was slow, It was so slow it looked from the outside like doing nothing at all. But it cost almost nothing, and time was the one thing a widow, with no money and no better prospect, had in great supply. She built her first pen out of the thorns themselves. There is an irony in that a country person feels in the bones that the thing tormenting you is also the thing that will save you. And Delia felt it as she dragged cut mesquite into a rough hedge and wove the branches until they made a barrier no goat would push through, a fence of the enemy's own body. Inside it, she put her 2 nannies and the buck she borrowed from an old man 3 miles east, a Basque named Echeverry, who had come to Texas by way of the Pyrenees, and who kept sheep and goats when everyone told him this was cattle country, and he was a fool. He was the only one who did not laugh. When she told him what she meant to do, he listened, with his hat in his hands and his eyes moving over her land, and then he said a thing she would carry the rest of her life. He said, in his slow accented English, that the land is never poor, only misjudged, that what one man calls waste is another man's harvest, and that the mesquite the cattleman cursed had fed goats and men in his own country for 1,000 years. Then he told her the practical thing, which was that the mesquite bean itself, the long yellow pod that dropped by the ton in late summer, was feed, sweet as molasses and fat with protein, and that her goats would grow strong on the very trees she meant them to destroy. She had not known that. It changed the whole arithmetic. The land that everyone said was worthless would feed the animals whose work would make it valuable. She went home turning it over and over, and she did not sleep, and it was not from worry. The first year was the hardest, and it was hard in a way that had no drama in it, which is the hardest kind. She rose before light every day, and worked until the dark took her hands from her. She built pens and moved pens. She cut mesquite and wove it into fence, and burned the deadwood and used the ash. She learned to read her goats, to know when a nanny was near to kidding, to pull a stuck kid in the cold with her sleeves rolled and her arms slick, to doctor foot rot and worm and the 100 small failures that can end a herd. She lived on beans and cornmeal and the milk her nannies gave, and she gathered mesquite beans by the sack in August and ground them into a sweet meal that she ate herself when the cornmeal ran low, and she was not too proud for it. The town watched from a distance and told itself the story it wanted. The widow Marsh, they said, was letting a pack of goats run wild on that ruined land because she had lost her wits along with her husband, and it was a pity, and someone ought to see about her. A woman alone could not run a place. Everyone agreed, least of all a place like that. When she came to town for salt and thread, they were kind to her face and merciless behind her back, and she heard both, and she said nothing to either. She had learned that being right is a poor argument, and that the only reply the land respects is work. So she kept her small victories banked low like a coal under ash, and she told no one that her 2 nannies had become 9, and that behind the first thorn fence there was already a patch of ground, a 1/4 acre, then 1/2 acre, where the mesquite stood dead and gray and stripped, and the first green blades of buffalo grass had come up through the opened dirt like something rising from the grave. By the second summer the 9 goats were 26, and the 1/4 acre was 4 acres, and Delia Marsh had begun to understand the true shape of what she was doing. The goats did not merely eat the mesquite. They changed everything they touched. Where they stripped the brush, the sun reached the ground for the first time in a generation, and the grass seed that had lain dormant in the soil woke and rose. Their hooves broke the crust of the caliche, and their droppings fed it, and the rain that used to sheet off the hard ground and cut gullies now sank in where the grass held it. She saw it happen in the space she had cleared first, that 1/4 acre that was now a small green pasture ringed by dead trees, and she stood in it one evening with the light going gold, and understood that she was not clearing land. She was making it. There is a difference, and it took her a year of aching hands to feel the difference in her chest. The cattlemen killed mesquite when they killed it at all, with axe and poison and fire, and left behind bare wounded dirt that grew back thornier than before. Her goats killed it and healed the ground in the same motion, and the pasture they left would feed the very cattle the cattlemen prized, only they were too proud to see it, or too proud to learn it from a woman with a herd of animals they held in contempt. She began to move her fences in a plan, opening a new section, letting the goats work it down over weeks, then moving them on and seeding the cleared ground and letting it rest. Etcheverry came to see it and walked the 4 green acres slowly and said nothing for a long while, and then he took off his hat and put it back on, which from him was the highest thing a man could say. It was Etcheverry who brought her the first outside believer, and it happened the way such things happen, sideways and by accident. The old Basque took goats to the railhead town twice a year and sold cabrito and cheese, and that second autumn he took a wheel of Delia's cheese along with his own, because her nannies had come to give more milk than her small household could use, and she had learned to make cheese the way her mother made it. Pressed and salted and aged in a cool cut in the caliche behind her cabin, the cheese went to a hotel kitchen in the railhead town, where a cook named Prudence Alba, a broad, quiet woman who had cooked in New Orleans before the fever took her family and sent her west, tasted it and stopped in the middle of her kitchen and asked where it came from. When she heard it came from goats browsing, Mesquite on ruined land 70 miles out, she said that was exactly why it tasted the way it did, that the mesquite and the wild sage and the bee brush gave the milk something the flat green pastures back east could never give, and she would take every wheel the widow could make and pay. And she wanted the cabrito, too, the tender kids, for the railroad men, and the drummers and the cattle buyers who ate at her tables and paid what she asked. Etcheverry carried the message back and the silver with it, and when he laid the coins in Delia Marsh's hand, she counted them twice and then sat down. It was more money than she had held since her husband died. It was more than the land had cost her many times over. And it had come out of the mesquite, the worthless mesquite, by way of the goats that everyone laughed at, and she understood then that the coal she had banked so long was ready to catch, and that she must be careful, because a woman alone, with something worth taking, is a woman the world will begin to notice. The world noticed. It noticed first, as talk, the way talk in a dry county turns from mockery to curiosity to something with an edge of envy in it. And the talk reached a man named Amos Curran, who was the largest cattleman in that part of the county, and who held a note on half the range around Delia's 75 acres. Curran had watched the widow's foolishness with the mild amusement of a rich man for 2 years, and now he heard that she was selling cheese and cabrito to a hotel for silver, and he heard, which interested him more, that the ruined thornland he had passed 1,000 times was coming up in grass. Grass was the thing Curran wanted more than anything on earth, because his own range was overgrazed and drying and choked with the mesquite his own herds had spread by carrying the beans in their bellies from pasture to pasture, and here was a woman turning the curse into pasture at no cost but time. He rode out to see it. He sat his good horse at the edge of her land and looked at the green sections advancing into the gray thorn and the fat goats moving through it. And Delia watched him from her cabin door and felt the day turn under her feet. He was smiling when he rode up, and his smile was worse than any laughing had been. He told her he admired her grit. He told her a place like this was a great deal for one woman alone to manage, and that he worried about her out here with no man and no backing, and that he was prepared, out of neighborly concern, to take the burden off her hands. He offered her $40 for the 75 acres. He said it warmly, as a kindness. She thanked him for his concern and told him the land was not for sale, and she watched his smile go thin, and she knew, the way an animal knows weather, that he would not leave it there. He did not leave it there. What Amos Curran did was the thing men of his kind have always done when the front door is closed to them, which is to look for the crack in the wall. He went to the county and inquired quietly about the widow Marsh's title, and he learned what she did not yet know, that the tax deed she held from the courthouse steps carried a redemption period, under the law of that state, 2 years in which the heirs of the former owner pay the back taxes and a penalty and take the land back out from under whoever had bought it. 2 years, and the 2 years were nearly up, with weeks left, and no heir had come, which meant the deed would soon be hers past all challenge. Curran could not wait for the law to close the door, so he found the heir himself. The dead man had a brother in a town 3 days north, a drinking man with debts of his own, and Curran sent a lawyer to him with a proposition that the brother had a legal right worth reclaiming, that the land had come up valuable, and that if the brother would redeem it and immediately sell it to Curran, there was $200 in it for a man who had never worked a day of that ground. The brother came south on the last train before the redemption period closed, with a paper and a lawyer and Curran's money behind him, and he walked into the courthouse to buy back the land the widow had made from nothing, and he was so pleased with the ease of it that when the clerk asked him a question, he answered it wrong, and that wrong answer was the crack in Amos Curran's own wall. Here is how it came apart, and it came apart the way these things do, through a man's own greed, betraying him in a small room full of witnesses. The clerk who handled the redemption was an honest old fellow named Pruitt, who had watched Delia Marsh raise her hand for that parcel 2 years before, and had watched the room laugh at her, and he had thought about her more than once in the time since, and he had heard, as everyone had, what she'd made of it. When the dead man's brother came to redeem the land, Pruitt was obliged by law to let him, and he began to fill out the papers with a heavy hand. But the law required proof of heirship, some showing that the man was truly the brother and truly the only heir, and Pruitt, who did not like the smell of it, asked the man a plain question. He asked how much the back taxes and the penalty came to, because an heir who had cared about the land, an heir who had known the dead man and grieved him, would know something of the debt against it. And the brother, who cared nothing for the land and everything for Curran's $200, said the sum with too much certainty, an exact figure down to the cent, a figure that had been told to him. Pruitt looked at him and asked mildly how a man 3 days north, who had not seen his brother in a decade, came to know the count so exact, and the brother, flustered, said that Mr. Curran's lawyer had given him the figure. And the room went quiet, and Pruitt set down his pen. There was a lawyer of Delia's own by then, because Prudence Alba the cook had a cousin in the railhead town who practiced law, and when the talk of Curran's maneuvering reached the hotel, Prudence had sent the cousin out to see the widow. And the cousin had looked at the tax deed and the calendar and told Delia the danger plainly, and told her also the one thing that might save her. The redemption by an heir had to be made in good faith for the heir's own benefit, not as a straw purchase arranged and paid for by a third party to seize property the heir did not want. A redemption bought and paid for by Amos Curran, funneled through a brother who had never seen the land and would sell it the same hour he claimed it, was not a redemption at all in the eyes of the law, but a fraud upon the court, and if it could be shown, the deed would stand and the widow would keep her land free and clear. So when the brother let slip that Curran's lawyer had fed him the numbers, Delia's lawyer, who was standing quiet at the back of that room because Pruitt had sent him word to come, stepped forward with the whole thing laid out, the $200, the lawyer's involvement, the sale already arranged before the redemption was even filed. The county judge was called. Curran was sent for. And Amos Curran, who had never in his life been made to stand in a small room and account for himself, came in expecting to smooth it over with his name and his cattle and his note-holding, and found instead a clerk, a cook's cousin, and a widow, all looking at him without fear. He tried the warm way first, the way that had always worked. And it did not work, and Delia Marsh watched it not work with a stillness she had earned across 2 years of holding her tongue. He said it was all a misunderstanding, that he had only meant to help a poor man reclaim his family's land, that his interest was neighborly. The judge asked him whether he had agreed to buy the land from the brother the moment it was redeemed, and Curran, who could not deny it because the brother had already said it, tried to explain, and every word he spoke wrapped tighter around him. The judge was not a soft man, but he was a fair one, and he had heard, as the whole county had, the story of the widow and her goats, and there is in most people, even hard people, a thing that loves to see the small stand up to the large and win. He ruled that the redemption was a sham arranged for Curran's benefit, that it would not stand, and that the tax deed of Delia Marsh was valid, and the redemption period now closed, so that the land was hers absolutely and forever. Then he did a thing he did not have to do. He looked at Amos Curran over the top of his spectacles and said, into the quiet, that a man who had all the land in the county and still could not bear that a widow should have 75 acres of thorn scrub had shown the room exactly what he was worth, and it was a great deal less than $9.40. Curran left without a word. The dead man's brother left too, 3 days north again, without his $200, and without the land, poorer than he came. And Delia Marsh walked out of the courthouse a second time with a paper in her hand, and this time no one laughed. She might have hated them then, the town that had mocked her, and the man who had tried to take everything, and no one would have blamed her if she had turned hard, if she had raised her prices and closed her hand and made them pay for the years of laughing. But hardship had taught Delia Marsh a different lesson than bitterness, and the true measure of what she had become showed itself, not in the courtroom, but in the dry summer that followed the summer. The rains failed across the whole county, and the arithmetic of survival came for everyone. It did not rain in April, and it did not rain in May. And by June, the range was brown, and the cattle tanks were rings of cracked mud, and the mesquite, which fears no drought because its roots go down 50 feet to water, no grass can reach, was the only green thing left on the land. The cattlemen who had cursed the mesquite and killed what they could of it now watched their pastures turn to dust, while the trees they hated stood untouched and dropped. In the worst of the drought, the heaviest crop of beans anyone could remember, ton upon ton of sweet yellow pods falling on ground too dry to grow anything else. And on Delia Marsh's 75 acres, the land that had been ruined and worthless, the goats grew fat. They ate the beans. The drought poured down. They browsed the deep-rooted brush that no dryness could touch. Her cleared pastures, the grass held in soil, the hooves had opened, and the droppings had fed, stayed green weeks longer than the cattleman's range, because water sinks where the ground is whole. The fortune of the county inverted in a single season. The men who had been rich in cattle watched their herds go gaunt, and the widow they had pitied had feed to spare. Now here is where the profit was, and here is where Delia Marsh chose. She could have sold her mesquite beans to the desperate cattleman at any price she named, because a starving herd is a buyer who cannot say no, and she could have watched Amos Curran come to her hat in hand and made him pay dear for the trees he had cursed. Prudence Alba, who had a hard head for business, told her plainly she could triple her price and be within her rights. But Delia thought about the beans on her own wagon 2 winters back, and the $11 in the handkerchief, and the way it feels to have nothing and be laughed at by people who have plenty, and she made a different arithmetic. She sent word through Echeverry that she had beans to sell, and she named a fair price, not a low one and not a high one, the price the beans were worth in a good year, and she held it there through the whole dry summer when she could have gouged them all. She sold feed to men who had scorned her, and did not remind them they had scorned her. She showed a young rancher who came to her near tears how to send his own thin cattle onto Mesquite Range to eat the pods and survive the summer, and she walked his fence line with him and showed him how the goats worked, and she did not charge him for the knowing. When Amos Curran's foreman came, sent by a proud beaten man who could not come himself, Delia sold him beans at the same fair price she gave everyone, no more and no less, and she sent back no message but the beans. Hunger changes a town. It is easier to laugh at a neighbor than to eat beside her, and it is easier to believe a woman is a fool than to admit you were wrong to mock her. But the drought took the ease out of everything and left only what was true, and what was true was that the widow Marsh had seen a thing they were all too proud to see, and had done a thing they were all too proud to do, and now in the worst year any of them could remember, she was the one with feed and green grass and silver, and she was selling it to them fairly instead of making them crawl. The rains came back the next spring, as they always do, and the county was different, and Delia Marsh was different in it. The talk had turned all the way around, the way talk does, from mockery to pity to grudging respect to something that was nearly pride, as though the town had always believed in her, as though no one had ever laughed. Ranchers came now not to scorn, but to learn, and she taught them, because Echeverry had taught her that knowledge hoarded is knowledge that dies, and she began to sell them, not just beans and cheese and cabrito, but goats themselves, bred herds to put on brush-choked range, and the method spread across that dry county and cleared thousands of acres over the years that came after. So that the very thing everyone had cursed became, through a widow and her animals, the making of the land. She kept working with her hands, until they were rough as bark, and she never did grow soft, but she grew easy, which is a different thing, easy in the way of a person who no longer has to prove anything to anyone. And it was in the spring, after the drought, that she cleared the last thick stand at the center of her 75 acres, the goats bringing it down, section by section, as they had brought down all the rest. And there beneath the fallen thorns, unknown and hidden for who knows how many years under that green war, stood the old stone corral, dry laid 4 feet high in a perfect ring by some hand long gone before the Mesquite ever took the land. Some rancher of an older time had built it and worked cattle there and moved on, and the thorns had swallowed it whole, and no one living had known it was there at all. She stood in the opened center of her land, with the stone ring around her and the goats moving through the last of the gray dead trees, and she understood that the mesquite had not ruined the land at all, it had only hidden it. Under the thorns had been pasture the whole time and good soil, and a corral built by people who had known this ground was worth working long before the county gave it up for $9.40 on the courthouse steps. What one man calls waste is another man's harvest. At Chevery's words, and they were true, and she said them aloud to the old man himself when he came to see the corral, and he laughed his slow laugh and told her she had learned the lesson better than he had taught it. She rebuilt the stone ring where the years had tumbled it, and she used it, and she is buried now within sight of it, in ground that is green in a dry country, and the goats she left behind still work the brush on land that other people once swore would grow nothing but thorns and regret. There is a lesson in it that has nothing to do with goats. It is that the world will tell you what is worthless with great confidence, and the world will laugh at you for wanting it, and the world will be wrong, because worth is not a thing a place is born with, but a thing a patient hand draws out of it, slow, day after day after day, until the coal banked under the ash finally catches you, and the light of it reaches even the ones who laughed.